percentage of offenders... Oh, right, yes. Well, I think, there's a mythology that most people who abuse have been abused, and that's often used. In fact, studies in prison show that offenders who have been convicted will report being offended, or if they're going to trial, will report being offended against. And I think that's misused so that they'll get more leniency. Look, there's variant figures, but I think you could, a rule of thumb, and I'll be interested, 50%? Yeah. Six. Yeah. But look, there's one that Anita did a few years ago. They came up with 6%. In society, we tend to believe it's most. That's a mythology. Look, there's variant figures, but it's certainly not the majority. I need to say that. So what we're saying is, who do we know who are the most abused sex or gender? Females. Who are most of the reported offenders? Males. In other words, being offended against doesn't mean you then become an offender. Doesn't carry over. Yeah. So if that's helpful. But look, I have to say something about in this field, you'll find a lot of variation in the statistics. You've found that, Anita, a lot of variance. For instance, we talk about offenders not reoffending. We call it the recidivist rate, their likelihood of reoffending. There's a lot of different variation about that rate of reoffending. But you do tend to find variation in the stats, but we know it's not a majority. Yeah. Another question?
I've spoken to you about the
School of Evangelism?
I've spoken to you about the School of Evangelism, and I asked you, does our church policy cover them, or should they have their own?
Okay. First of all, the Penrith Church has a school of evangelism. How many churches in Sydney have a school of evangelism? None. You're a bunch of pioneers, you know that, don't you? You should be saying, we're pretty good here, we've got a school of evangelism. Because I don't know any other church that has. Congratulations. And I mean, that is a huge initiative. However, with every initiative, there's a responsibility. And my advice, for what it's worth, would be that the School of Evangelism, as an extension of the church, would operate under the church policy, but should have a sub-policy because it will have a different environment. I need to tell you folks, I don't think there's any of us, including myself, have any idea the amount of abuse that occurs within church-based institutions. The history is horrific. And the more that we discover, the more that we find out, it's just at a scale that we've never dreamed of. So if you've got an church institution like a church with a school of evangelism, to protect the name of the school of evangelism and to protect primarily the children that might be involved, why wouldn't you have a simple but effective policy and procedures that just monitors and watches and makes sure that the kids are safe and that they can be demonstrated to be following good practice? I can't see, you wouldn't want your school of evangelism compromised in any way by any kind of valid or invalid allegation, would you? It would compromise, it would shut it down overnight, folks. So my advice would be, yeah, look, School of Evangelism, we'll help you write one if need be. Just a policy and measures in place so it can be easily followed. So kids who are children of residents, who are on courses, are definitely protected by the measures in place, whatever. Here's a good story, here's a bad story for you. Colleague of mine, they were doing a church build. Now, I contributed to the building fund, so I can tell you the story this morning to show I believe in building funds. So they're doing a rebuild of the church. You know, we've all been on working bees. You know how they go, don't you? All Sunday, you come home absolutely exhausted and you've got to do the washing, that sort of thing. Okay, so all the church, a lot of tradies in the church, they're working their little innards out, rebuilding this big part of the church. And kids are having a wonderful time, like this is a country church, running amok, having a lifetime of their lives. They loved working bees, because mum and dad were so busy, they weren't getting into trouble, they could do what they like. Anyway, the neighbour, who's been a neighbour of the church forever, and everybody knows the neighbour, he's a lovely old man, he's looking on, he comes over, and he tells the church what they should have known. He says, guys, I'm looking from my fence, and I can see all your kids running everywhere, including all over a work site with electric saws and drills and stuff everywhere, and no one's supervising them. So they needed the guy over the fence to point out the obvious. These are all loving parents who are so committed, giving up their Sunday. No one even thought about it. Leg off here, hand off there, wouldn't have, too late then. So, and the lovely man actually made a suggestion, I will become the watcher for your kids. They can come and play in my yard, which they did. My colleague happened to be the head of the unit in that part of Australia for child sexual assault, and up on the computer one day came a name. Someone had offended against a policeman's son. Not a good move. Guess who it was? The loving neighbour. So when they talked to the kids, half the kids of the church had been abused by this man. So what do you think about that? Here's a church that was totally unaware. Someone brought to their awareness how they could do it better, but they didn't do it very well. And painfully, they discovered they really need to sit down before the event, think it through, have measures in place. And they could have done that. So they learnt the hard way. That was in the days when we never thought about child abuse. But even my colleague who knew a lot about it, because it was church, we all think church is safe. I pastored churches for nearly 20 years directly, and I didn't think about child sexual abuse. We didn't know about it, we didn't understand it, and the private stories we knew, we didn't associate with church. But now we know. So there's the most long-winded answer to a simple question. But I hope it works. But another short word is we're happy to work with you on if it's helpful. But it's great you've got one. Oh.
What if you think a child is being abused? I don't mean sexually.
Yes.
I mean physically abused, bullying,
Yes.
whatever. What do you do about it?
It's a reportable offence in New South Wales. It's actually a crime. And what I know is that if we don't intervene on the behalf of children, who will? Now, there are who measures abuse? That's the difficulty. You don't have to be an investigator, but if you have a concern. Now, if you have heard those horrible stories that all of us have heard about, what do they call a child? I've forgotten. Docs. Okay. There's more stories than can be said, and you're a bit reluctant to ring them up or the police in case something horrible, worse happens. This is what you can do, and I've done this so many times. It's so helpful. I ring up docs and say, look, I know a situation and I just want some advice. What would you suggest? And I have found the most helpful people give me really good suggestions. That you can test the water. But to be honest, an intervention, sometimes it's just parents who don't know how to do it better and they need positive support and reinforcement and da-da-da. And the police coming in isn't always the most helpful. But if a child's been really neglected or really been physically abused, you need some intervention. And that's why we do have child authorities and they do need it. So you have that option. You can ring up. By the way, you don't have to prove that abuse is occurring, and it is a confidential thing, and you cannot be sued. You simply cannot be sued for doing what you reasonably believe is abuse. Now, if you don't like your neighbour and you really take objection to some of the stuff in their backyard and this is payback time, beware. That's not a reasonable grounds for reporting. But if it's about reasonable grounds, you can. But look, if some other intervention that can stop the abuse can be invoked short term, fantastic. But look, if we don't do something for kids, who does it for them? And one of the saddest things I hear over the years is the kids who are now adults who tell me, basically, there was no one there for me as a kid. Everybody loved him. He was that lovely man in the church or in the school. No one was there for me. And that's what really, really hurts. Really hurts. And, it's like God was so far away, I don't count in the universe. I actually don't fit within his sphere of love because no one spoke for him on his behalf for me. So we do have responsibility in that sense. And if you can do something yourself, great, but you do have that option.
There was a caller on Talkback Radio this week. He said that he had been abused from the ages of 5 to
Off the deep end. Really common. Here's a stat for you that's scary, folks. Kids who witness domestic violence are more likely to grow up and sexually abuse kids than kids who are victims of sexual abuse. Don't underestimate the power of domestic violence. It's huge. The impact it has on children is absolutely huge. Yeah. I'm just saying that children who witness or experience domestic violence, physical violence in the home, whatever, are more likely to become sexual abusers than kids who are victims of sexual abuse. Yeah, that's you wouldn't expect that, would you? Yeah, that came out of a study in New South Wales, but since there's lots of literature around, or maybe even before, that sustains that. Yeah. So physical violence is an assault against the child's being. Sexual abuse has an insidious assault. It actually somehow touches the very self-awareness and sense of who the person is. It's deep down in their soul. Deep down, makes huge scars. The good news is that many people who have been sexually or abused in any form in their childhood have wonderful resilience and go on to live wonderful lives. But remember that others don't. Some need counselling and recover. There are some who never recover. But all bear the wounds. All bear the wounds. Yeah. It's been a hard afternoon, hasn't it? I wished I could have done Joy to the World for you this afternoon, but that's a little nearer Christmas. But folks, sometimes we have to struggle with the difficult issues. And in that struggle, better things come. Who saw Amazing Grace? The story of someone who struggled for such a long time with such a hard issue, slavery. And yet today we have another form of slavery for children that goes into adulthood. And if we don't stand up in our own way and the ability that God has given us, who will? And if the church is not a model of a good and a safe place, wherever will there be one? Yeah. It's a challenge, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, there are. There are. Church-based ones, some organisations run stuff for their kids in church settings, but one of the easiest ones to access, and you could adapt it, is literally a program called Protective Behaviours. Are there any people connected with the Protective Behaviours organisation here? Protective Behaviours is a really interesting program. There's actually an organisation called Protective Behaviours. And its origins, the whole notion of protective behaviours began with, of all people, a woman in South Australia who ultimately went to America and is a huge name. Her name is Peg Flandrell West. She was a social worker, South Australian. Huge name in America. We didn't even know who she was. But she founded an organisation that teaches kids age-appropriate protective behaviours. So right from little tots, year appropriate, all through their school years, are programs designed to help them be aware of issues of safety, how to actually understand when they feel unsafe, and how to access wherever possible help. Now, the idea of protective behaviours is not that we put the onus on the kids to keep themselves safe. It's up to adults to keep kids safe. But part of adults keeping kids safe is to help kids have an awareness and have resources. So that, yeah, and that's in New South Wales. It was brought back to Australia by the police, and they work in conjunction with community-based organisations and teachers. And I'm actually a trainer for protective behaviour. It's a great idea, and you can get those resources and adapt them for church settings. So yeah, there are programs around, there are resources, and there's some church resources, a few. General Conference doesn't have a lot. But look, we can access. So you could, at our unit, we actually produced a draft of how protective behaviour thinking could be introduced for children in Sabbath school and all their their quarterly Bible stuff. But it has not readily been accepted. But you could do it in your own church Sabbath schools for kids. Just the notions of how kids could do little things to keep themselves safe. Yeah. Have networks. There's a little network of people. They write names to mum and maybe dad or uncle or auntie or pastor or teacher or elder or friend or whatever. They write those names on their fingers and they figure out 5 to 10 people who they could go to if they don't feel safe. And then we teach them to review that, like, that uncle's become a bit, don't like him very much now. So he comes off the list, someone else goes on. And we actually, so they do what we call network review. And we teach them things like, there's nothing so awful that you can't talk about it. There's nothing that happens to you that you can't go and tell someone. Because one of the things is that kids feel that they're the only one that this awful things happen to. They couldn't possibly tell anybody. So we teach them those simple things and how to actually talk about safe and unsafe experiences, to use appropriate language, that we talk about the whole notion of what is a secret. Is having a secret really a good thing? Or are there any good secrets? And what are bad secrets? We talk about that because kids are told they have to keep it secret, so they don't tell anybody. A colleague of mine, she taught her kids all the protective behaviours, but missed something. She didn't realise, and she tells us on herself. She says kids didn't tell when a number of their peers were being sexually abused. And when she found out and asked, why didn't you tell? Well, he tried it on us and we told them if he did that again, we'd tell Mum. And he never tried it again, so he never did anything bad to us. You said to tell if anything bad happened. Nothing happened to us. So the way kids think is a little bit different to adults. But, you know, if you've got that conversation going for children. So, yeah, look, resources. And look, I've got a card here. You're welcome to ring our office and we can help find resources. And they put out lots of books, ideas, stuff you could get for your church library, etc. Yeah. And I just think we can't do enough, so I love your question. Just love it. Yeah. Look, I'm not going to show any more slides because you'll all be having nightmares tonight, and then I'll have to take responsibility for that. But I think you've got an overview, a sense of enough that this is an issue. It's a major issue. It happens in churches. Why would a church be so vulnerable? You can go to websites, folks, where groups of people trade information on where the best source of available children are for their particular interests. They trade photographs and then drop websites down. It's been in the news, hasn't it? All those hits on websites. They trade it. Churches are at the top of their list as the place where the most kids are, where people are least likely to monitor them. So, yeah, and they're the most trusting of communities. So we really need to actually say, hey, we want to teach children trust. We want for them not to have that trust betrayed. We want our communities to be trusting and to enjoy being communities. But to ensure that, we actually have to be more aware and actually teach about responsible and irresponsible trust, etc. Yeah, so we've got a responsibility there. Any more questions? Yes.
But what happens if we discover we do have a child abuser in our midst? Because I know the first thing to do is condemn and say, oh, he should be given the death penalty, but that's not necessarily the Christian way to respond. But we do need to keep our children safe at the same time.
I'd like to respond to that. I appreciate the question. Conference I attended just a few weeks ago of professionals in this arena, really interesting. And one of the themes of that conference was how we demonise those who offend. We make them into monsters. We call them Satan. We actually are responding to our own fears of our own human frailty. Now, I'm not suggesting here that most of us want to go and offend against children, but we all have a bit of a shadow side that we don't like to get in touch with. And when people do bad things, sometimes we are distanced from that because we're sometimes capable of doing maybe different sorts of bad things, but we're all capable of doing bad things. So if we demonise someone, we don't have to think of them as human, and they're not like us, and we don't have to worry about that. But I would like to suggest what has been said is that we are all children of God, made in His image, and that we need to take a different view, and we need to actually learn that to keep children safe means good practice. It doesn't actually help to demonize people or make them other than human. Because all we're doing is putting energy, we're in an unhelpful area. We need to put our energy in how to keep children safe. Now, what about those who do abuse children, who might want to come and worship in our congregations or have abused children? What we need to do is make sure that they are kept safe and that they are not able to abuse children or be accused of what they haven't done. So we have a response to keep them safe as well. What intrigued me at this conference that I attended was the general outrage against the notion that people who abuse against children should ever be in congregations. There was a strong reaction to that. The Anglican Church has a process where people sign an agreement that they voluntarily go into if they have a conviction history or if they have areas of doubt in this area. They actually sign to certain conditions what they will and won't do so they can attend church. And we have actually introduced a similar notion, and we're just working on that at the moment just so it's workable, and it's been tried in different parts of Australia, where someone who has a conviction history or has had a professional discipline in this area against children, that they actually have an assessment of their level of risk. So if they're high risk of offending, they shouldn't be in a congregation at this time. They need to be working on accountability and in personal work so they can lower, if possible, the risk of offending. So we have that as a thing. If they have a medium to high risk, we say that that person at this time needs not to be in a congregation. They need to be in programs that help lower their risk. If they're low risk, we need to then write around them conditions that enable the church to feel safe, the children to be safe, and the individual to feel safe so that they can have some sense of ministry. And what we say is, well, look, they shouldn't be involved ever in children's programs, ever. That means never. That they should have someone who sits or they have someone who helps supervise their presence in a congregation so they're not accused of doing things they haven't done, and also that they're not able to do things that they need not to do. So we have strict conditions, but that they are able to have a connection with the congregation. So we have a ministry. It's hard to play out, and it's important that we actually understand that our humanity sometimes gets in the way of doing ministry. So we're working on that. We call them safety agreements, and we're bringing out a new child safety policy, and in that we actually talk about the safety agreement. In the old policy we called them limited access agreement, but we think safety agreement actually probably says more about what we want to say. So we're saying, look, there should be room for someone in a congregation, have opportunity to worship, if that's in a acceptable degree of safety. There's always risk in everything. But if we're putting the congregation, the children of the congregation at risk, that's not acceptable. But so that we provide some form of ministry. But it's hard, and it will always have difficulties around it, but we're having a go at it. I hope that's helpful. Yeah. I mean, you need to know that some people offend and will always offend, and they're not interested in not offending. Others don't want to offend, but they need to actually have very strict boundaries around them so that they don't offend, because even if they don't want to offend, they have a high probability to offending. Yeah. I hope that didn't sound too contorted. Yeah. Oh, put my glasses on. It's Anita.
Hi. I know that with some of our churches, when there's been a disclosure of child sexual assault abuse, that it had a tendency to factionise the church.
Right.
And so there'd be one half of the church being supportive of the abuser and the other half of the child who's been abused. What's your experience of that, and do you know of any churches who've been able to resolve that issue and how they went about doing it?
Anita, thanks so much. And I know that you know a lot about these issues, and I think you're fortunate to have people in your congregations who work in these areas. Anita's question is the potential that when abuse is discovered or disclosed in a church congregation, the potential for that to cause polarisation and controversy. Let me assure you, it's almost predictably will, and it's almost inevitable. It does. And unfortunately, my experiences of dealing with congregations, and there's quite a few now in this area, has been quite sad. And I have seen really nice congregations just rip apart over this issue. Now, one of the issues is that you need education in your congregation prior to such events happening, so that when the congregation face the issue, if it's in their congregation, they already have the information on board. Because when these events break, there's a high amount of emotionality. People are really emotional about this. It sets off stuff inside of us, our own fears, our own experiences, our own histories. They get twigged, and we tend to respond not necessarily in sensible fashions. And it's nothing to do with intelligence, I've noticed. So one of the things I would say to your congregation, as any congregation, do what we're doing now. Get intelligent about these issues, know about them, have measures in place, have proactive and keep ongoing education going, so that when something is reported, or if it should get known to the congregation also already understands the nature of the issues. That will not stop necessarily strong reactions. And ironically, I have seen people who work in the field get quite irrational when it comes close to home. And if any of you, as I've had, have experienced this in family or extended family, it causes huge division. And people tend to go into a loyalty camp. They're either for or against. They can't walk the medium ground. And it's really hard also to support the alleged victim and the alleged offender. You find that both feel you're betraying the other, betraying them to be talking to the other. So it's a really hard area. So you need to actually have plans in place for how you administer to both, etc., etc. But yeah, it's very, very conflictual. That's why I do want our churches to do what you're doing, talk about the issues ahead of time, get more information, put measures in place so that it's not so likely to happen. But it happens, folks, it happens. And I think what I've seen is so sad that I've seen elders, boards conflict over it, drop out of office, folks sometimes drop out of church, and they're quite convinced that no matter what is done, it's wrong. It's really hard. It's about that loyalty thing. I think one of the things that we don't understand is the high degree of manipulation that offenders actually have. It's just beyond most of our understandings, how well they can manipulate whole environments. And they will manipulate their fellow officers, pastors, congregations. And they actually almost, I've seen it happen, almost just stand aside and let the congregation rip itself apart, and they will let it happen to be able to continue their role. So, and I've seen people who, and I came across one just yesterday, they come out of prison and expect, for child-related offences, and expect to step straight back into church office in the old role. Don't have really good comprehension of the damage that they wreak. In fact, that's been my experience. They simply don't get it in terms of the damage they wreak in other people's lives. They may have even good intentions, but they find it hard to understand. Some offenders are so good at manipulating Scripture and their good works and say, look, how could a good person like me, who does so many Bible studies, who's brought so many people into church, do such a bad thing? And how do you argue against that? You know, that kind of stuff is really hard to deal with. It's spiritual abuse, but it works really well. So I think praying to be a church that's committed to truth and the best for the church and its children, and praying for each other so that we don't rip ourselves apart in these difficult situations. Look, it's true in scout movements and schools, wherever you have a community and abuse breaks, it causes incredible division and pain. Can you understand now why kids just retract their story? It's all too hard. Adults retract their stories. Adults who tell stories of childhood abuse within a congregation or community just take their story or take themselves away. It's just too hard to live with the way that the responses are often directed at them or at other members in the church. So yeah, we need to really pray and work hard that that not happen ever in our congregation in Penrith, because I really want to keep enjoying coming here. Yeah, but I do take your point. Look, there are things you can do as well. We actually put a little booklet, it's out of date now, I need to redo it, and how congregations can manage the conflict. And there's a wonderful movement, a team in Australia that train denominations on how to manage the conflict. Because conflict's not bad, it's what we do with it. That's the problem. And when emotion takes over, it destroys the value of the conflict. But yeah, there are good things you can do. You need openness, opportunities for people to talk about how they're feeling, to talk about what they think's happening, to be able to recount what they've experienced. And I've done that. I've done break-up groups where members write on paper, they share, and by telling the story and getting it out there, it helps them come to grips with it, and one day healing starts. But yeah, they need to do work. It doesn't just go away. You have to do that congregational hard work. I've been a member, folks, of a congregation where my pastor offended against someone in the congregation. The most popular of pastors. I happen to be, isn't it ironic? I work in this area and I was a member of his church. I actually had a real life story unfold to me, the damage it does. And guess what? Guess what? Who do people side with? The pastor. Right? Why not? For lots of obvious reasons. So the victim gets demonised. Or they get really angry with the pastor and the church and all your efforts. But I actually know how it feels to actually be in the congregation and watch it unravel around me and how I felt betrayed. I personally felt totally betrayed. It was like he betrayed me. In actual fact, he betrayed the trust of one of his parishioners. But look, I've seen it from both sides. I've helped manage it, but I've actually been a member of it, and I draw on what I learned from that. It's quite painful, yeah. Well, folks, I think that you all ought to go do a very safe touch. Give yourself a pat on the shoulder for doing what we've done today. It's a tough area. It's emotionally hard. And I have to be honest, I have shed many tears in this area for the people I work with and the stories that I've heard and the stories that they connect with my own stories. We all have stories of life, and when we feel pain, we connect our pain with other people's pain. It's hard. But I want to commend your courage for being the ones that came back and faced it and are working it, and a church that's already done this before and got a policy. Feel good about those things and have lots of hope for the future. Here's a church that's got lots of kids that have got a chance of keeping safe. I really love that. Heather, I think we've done it. Yes. 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 Okay. What would you like to do? Have a prayer and go home and recuperate.